You wake up in Athens owing money to a man whose sandals cost more than your goat. That is bad. Then you remember, the loan was secured on your body, wife, children, and the little patch of attic dirt that supposedly makes you free. Ancient Athens loved to brag about liberty, democracy, and noble citizens arguing in public. But before the famous jury courts and marble speeches, a lot of ordinary Athenians were one missed harvest away from becoming human collateral. Welcome to the birthplace of democracy. Please keep your wrists available for repossession. Your farm has a mortgage stone. Your day begins before sunrise in the dusty countryside of Attica, the territory around Athens. You are not wearing a shiny helmet. You are not debating philosophy under a colonnade. You are trying to coax barley out of thin soil while pretending the olive trees are not judging you. On the edge of your land stands a stone marker called a horos. It is not decorative. It is a public little billboard announcing that this land is tied to debt. Anyone walking by can see that your farm is under obligation to someone richer. And in a village economy where everybody knows everybody, that stone might as well shout, "Hello, this household is financially cooked." Aristotle's Constitution of the Athenians, written centuries later but drawing on older traditions, says that before Solon, the poor, along with their wives and children, were effectively enslaved to the rich. Many were called hectomoroi, often translated as sixth-part tenants. The exact arrangement is debated, because ancient paperwork did not survive with helpful folders, but the basic idea is brutal enough. You work land controlled by the wealthy, and a share of your crop goes upward. Fail to pay, and the debt does not politely become a stern email. It becomes a claim on your person. This is the part people skip when they turn ancient Athens into a clean origin story for democracy. Before the famous citizen juries, the city is choking on inequality. Poor farmers borrow seed, grain, or money to survive bad years. A drought, a sick ox, one family funeral too many, and suddenly, your body is part of the repayment plan. Debt in archaic Athens is not a spreadsheet problem. It is a social death trap with legal manners. And yes, the Athenians later became very proud of their freedom. That is adorable, considering they had to invent a reform package whose main achievement was, maybe citizens should stop selling other citizens into slavery over barley. Congratulations, you are collateral. The loan document does not need to say, "This will ruin your life," in giant red letters. Everybody understands the risk. A poor Athenian can borrow on the security of his own person, which means if he defaults, he can be seized. His children can be dragged into it too. His wife is not magically protected by classical civilization. The household is the unit, and the household can be crushed. Aristotle says all borrowing was on the security of the debtor's persons until Solon. Plutarch, writing much later, says Solon's first public measure wiped out existing debts and banned future loans on the person of the borrower. Between those sources sits a giant historical headache, because scholars argue over how total the debt cancellation really was, what kinds of debt were included, and whether later writers misunderstood some details. But they agree on the central horror. Debt bondage was a real crisis in early Athens, and Solon's reform was remembered as the moment the burden got shaken off. The Greek word for that reform was sysaxthia, the shaking off of burdens. It sounds poetic, because Solon was a poet as well as a lawgiver. Also because branding matters. If you are about to detonate the credit system and infuriate every wealthy lender in town, it helps to give the policy a name that sounds less like economic chaos and more like a cleansing ritual. For you, before Solon, the burden is not symbolic. If the creditor comes, you may be taken to work his land or household. If the debt is bad enough, you might be sold abroad, away from Attica, into a world where nobody knows your name, your deme, your father, or the olive tree you still insist would have produced next year if the weather had behaved. The humiliation is part of the system. Free citizen status is supposed to matter. You can claim descent, family, community, the whole ancestral membership package, but if your debt wins, your freedom loses. Athens has not yet built the democratic machine that later lets poorer citizens sit on juries and vote in the assembly. The law is closer to a locked door, and the key is held by men who own storage jars full of grain. Nobody needs to be cartoonishly evil for the machine to work. A wealthy landowner wants repayment. A poor farmer wants to survive winter. The law gives teeth to the loan. The harvest fails. Then everyone acts surprised when the village starts looking less like a community and more like a slow-motion auction. The rich men also hate this, somehow. By the early 6th century BC, Athens is stuck. The poor are furious because they are being squeezed into bondage. The rich are furious because the poor are furious. Noble families are fighting because owning land and power was not enough entertainment. Aristotle says the conflict between rich and poor lasted a long time until both sides chose Solon as archon and mediator. That detail matters. Solon was not simply a revolutionary hero arriving with a cape made of justice. He came from a high-status family, but was not one of the richest men. He had enough aristocratic credibility that the elite could tolerate him. Solon's own poems blame greed and arrogance among the wealthy for the crisis. He tells the rich to restrain their swollen hearts. Ancient political poetry could be spicy. No campaign consultant would advise, "Your hearts are swollen with greed." But Solon was not trying to trend on every platform. He was trying to stop a city from tearing itself open. Imagine being you, the indebted farmer, hearing that a mediator has been appointed. Hope is dangerous. Maybe your debt disappears. Maybe the rich trick everyone. Maybe the whole thing collapses and a tyrant takes over. Because that was a popular, archaic Greek hobby. You do not know. The elite also have reasons to worry. If Solon cancels debts, they lose money. If he does not, the poor may revolt. If he gives too much power to the masses, aristocrats lose control. Everyone wants Solon to save the city, preferably in a way where their side gets everything and the other side learns humility. Solon does what every mediator dreams of doing. He makes both sides angry enough that later writers treat that as proof of his honesty. Plutarch says Solon was asked whether he gave Athens the best laws, and he answered, the best they would receive. That is not a victory lap. That is a man saying, I worked with the available idiots. The shaking off gets weird. The Sisakthia is remembered as Solon's great debt reform. Existing debts are cancelled, or at least a major class of them is relieved. Loans secured on the body are forbidden. Debt slaves are freed. Those sold abroad are supposedly brought back if they can be found. The horoi, the mortgage stones, are removed from the land. Solon even boasts in poetry that he pulled up the markers fixed in the earth, and the black land that had been enslaved was now free. That is a strong line. The soil gets liberated before some people do in later societies, which feels uncomfortably on brand for human history. For you, the reform might mean the stone on your field comes down. The debt that sat over your family disappears. Your children are no longer future inventory. If you had already been seized, it might mean release. If you had been sold beyond Athens, the story becomes more uncertain. Plutarch says some Athenians who had wandered so long in foreign lands that they had forgotten the Attic tongue were brought back. That image is heartbreaking, but we should keep one hand on the caution rail, because Plutarch wrote centuries after Solon and loved a good moral scene. Still, the memory stuck because something dramatic happened. Solon did not merely adjust interest rates and call it a day, although one ancient writer, Androtion, apparently claimed the reform reduced interest rather than canceling debts outright. Plutarch reports that disagreement. Aristotle treats the cancellation as real but admits the details were already argued over in antiquity. Translation. Even ancient historians were in the comments section throwing chairs. There is also a delicious scandal. Aristotle says Solon allegedly told some friends about the coming reform. Those friends borrowed money, bought land, and then benefited when debts were cancelled. Some enemies accuse Solon himself of joining the scheme. Aristotle rejects that charge as unlikely, because Solon's general conduct was moderate and public-spirited. Still, the rumor is fantastic. The man trying to rescue Athens from predatory finance gets accused of insider trading before there are securities, regulators, suits, or little televised hearings where everyone says, "Senator, I do not recall." For ordinary debtors, the gossip matters less than the result. Your body is no longer acceptable collateral for a citizen loan. That is not full equality. That is not modern rights. It is still a giant shift. Athens has discovered that a society cannot call its citizens free while allowing lenders to carry them off when the barley math goes bad. Revolutionary? Yes. Clean and complete? Absolutely not. This is Athens. Nothing gets to be simple. You are free, but please stay poor. Solon frees debtors, but he does not hand the city to the poor. This is important because every heroic reform story wants a neat before and after. Before, oppression. After, democracy with better lighting. The actual Solonian settlement is more annoying because history was not written by a screenwriter who respects pacing. Solon divides citizens into property classes based on agricultural yield. The richest are the pentakosio medimnoi, men whose land produces 500 measures in a year. Below them are the hippiais, wealthy enough to keep a horse, then the zeugitai, and finally the thetes, the poorest citizens. If you are a former debt-bound farmer barely holding your household together, congratulations, you are probably a thete. Your prize is not holding the top offices. Plutarch says the thetes could take part in the assembly and sit as jurors, but they could not hold magistracies. Aristotle also emphasizes Solon's creation or strengthening of appeal to the popular court as a major democratic element. That means your political power does not arrive as a golden throne. It arrives as a bench, a vote, and the chance to judge disputes when richer men are screaming at each other. This is the quiet twist. Solon does not make the poor rulers of Athens, but he gives them access to the courts. At first, Plutarch says, this seemed minor. Later, it became enormous, because if disputes could be appealed to citizen jurors, then ordinary citizens became the final word in many public and private cases. The rich still had money, names, horses, friends, and better cloaks. The poor got ballots. Do not romanticize it too hard. Women, enslaved people, resident foreigners, and children are outside this citizen system. Athens is not modern democracy wearing a toga. It is a citizen club with a very aggressive door policy. But if you are a poor male citizen, the difference is real. Yesterday you could be collateral. Tomorrow you might sit in judgment over the kind of man who once treated your household as a risky asset. That is not justice perfected. That is justice discovering a sense of humor. The court is a civic blender. The famous Athenian people's courts, the dikasteria, grow into one of the strangest legal institutions in the ancient world. By the 5th and 4th centuries BC, Athens is selecting large citizen juries by lot. Some panels have hundreds of jurors. Important public cases can have 500, 1,000, or even more. The annual pool is often given as 6,000 jurors, chosen from citizens over 30. 6,000. For a city-state, that is not a jury pool. That is a small army of opinionated uncles. Aristotle's Constitution of the Athenians gives wonderfully nerdy details about the process. Jurors have tickets with their name, father's name, deme, and a letter. There are boxes, urns, lettered tokens, staffs, and daily randomization meant to make bribery harder. The system is trying to solve a very Athenian problem. How do you let ordinary citizens run courts without letting rich men buy the verdict before breakfast? Jurors had to be over 30 and not in debt to the public treasury or disenfranchised. That public debt rule is almost rude given the city's history. Private debt bondage had been abolished, but owing the state could still wreck your civic standing. Athens was generous with liberty until you owed Athens money. Then, liberty had office hours. Pericles later introduced pay for jury service, and Aristotle says it was part of the broader democratization of the city. Pay mattered because poor citizens cannot spend a day in court for free while their fields or families wait. Without pay, public participation belongs to people rich enough to treat politics as a hobby. With pay, even modest citizens can show up. Ancient Athens did not invent perfect equality, but it understood that unpaid civic duty tends to become aristocratic cosplay. For you, a former debt slave or the child of one, the court is more than a legal venue. It is the place where the city says your judgment counts. You listen to speeches. You weigh evidence. You drop a voting pebble or ballot. No judge in a powdered wig tells you what to think. The citizens decide. Welcome to trial by speech timer. Athenian trials do not work the way modern courtroom dramas train us to expect. There are no professional lawyers standing up to say objection with immaculate hair. Litigants normally speak for themselves, although they can hire speechwriters called logographers to prepare the performance. So yes, Athens had legal ghostwriters. The ancient economy truly had room for every hustle. Speeches are timed by a water clock, the clepsydra. Water flows out, time disappears, and your chance to persuade hundreds of fellow citizens drains away in public. The metaphor is almost too perfect. If you are bad at speaking, too bad. If your opponent is rich enough to hire a brilliant speechwriter, extra too bad. The democratic court gives citizens power, but it does not make everyone equally persuasive. Athens never met an inequality it could not partially reform and then leave awkwardly alive in the corner. The jurors do not withdraw for calm deliberation. They vote. Aristotle describes two voting pebbles in later procedure, one with a hole and one solid, with jars arranged so jurors can cast votes secretly. The herald explains which pebble counts for which side. Votes are counted, the larger number wins, and if the votes are equal, the defendant wins. Then, in some cases, the jury votes again on the penalty or damages. That means your day in court is a battle for mass attention. The speaker must tell a story that sounds lawful, moral, patriotic, and believable to hundreds of citizens who may be hungry, tired, suspicious, and waiting for their jury pay. Legal argument, character assassination, family drama, and civic theater all blend together. If this sounds messy, yes. If it sounds more democratic than a small panel of aristocrats deciding your fate in private, also, yes. Athens is not giving you a clean legal machine. Athens is giving you a noisy civic blender and saying, "Good luck, citizen, press puree. The ex-debtor gets a vote." Now place yourself inside that court. You are older, over 30, a citizen in good standing, no longer under a creditor's thumb. Maybe your father remembered the Horos stone. Maybe you yourself were once bound. Either way, the memory of debt slavery hangs over the city. A rich man stands before the jury. He speaks about contracts, obligations, order, and the danger of letting people escape what they owe. Another man, poorer, speaks about exploitation and the old arrogance of the wealthy. The case may not be about Solon's reform directly, but Athenian jurors bring their class memories with them. This is why the courts become politically explosive. Aristotle says the right of appeal to the jury court was a chief basis of the power of the multitude. because the people, having the vote, become sovereign. That sentence should get more attention than it does. Sovereignty is not just standing in the assembly shouting about war, it is also deciding who wins when law and status collide. The poor citizen's court power is especially strange, because Athens still depends heavily on slavery. Enslaved people work in households, mines, farms, shops, and public roles. The city can abolish debt slavery for citizens, while continuing chattel slavery for non-citizens and foreigners. That contradiction is not a footnote, it is the foundation. Athenian freedom often meant citizen freedom, protected against the kind of domination that still defined other people's lives. So when you vote, you are not living in a moral paradise. You are inside a system that expanded power for some while, excluding many. But for the citizen poor, the shift is still astonishing. Your body cannot be pledged for a loan. Your landmarker can be pulled up. Your vote can help decide court cases. The man who once could have seized you may now need to persuade you. That is the kind of irony historians keep in a locked cabinet so it does not escape and hurt someone. Athens monetizes civic grumbling. By the time Athens becomes a naval empire after the Persian Wars, the courts are daily life. Aristotle says tribute, taxes, and allied payments supported thousands, including 6,000 jurors, the council, archers, cavalry, dock guards, officials, orphans, and other public expenses. Empire helped fund democracy. Again, Athens refuses to let us enjoy a clean story. Jury pay begins under Pericles, according to Aristotle, as a democratic counterweight to elite generosity. Simon, a wealthy aristocrat, had used his fortune to feed and help people from his deme, basically turning private wealth into political affection. Pericles could not compete with that bank account, so he helped create public pay. The city, not one rich patron, would support citizen service. Very noble. Also politically useful. History loves motives, with multiple suspicious tabs open. For poorer citizens, jury pay is not luxury. It is a reason participation becomes possible. The daily amount changes over time, later associated with 3 obols, enough for modest subsistence rather than glamorous living. Nobody is buying a beach villa on jury wages, but that little payment changes who can sit in judgment. A court packed only with the comfortable will hear poverty one way. Comedy writers noticed, Aristophanes, in his play Wasps, mocks old men obsessed with jury service, addicted to the power, the pay, and the pleasure of judging. The joke works because everyone recognizes the phenomenon. Give a retired man a ballot, a stipend, and the authority to ruin someone's day, and suddenly democracy has built a theme park. This is where the old debt crisis echoes. Solon gave poorer citizens a legal foothold. Later, democracy turned that foothold into an institution with pay, procedures, mass juries, and serious political muscle. The journey from human collateral to paid juror is not straight, and it is not universal, but it is one of the sharpest transformations in ancient political history. Athens did not wake up democratic because philosophers had nice thoughts. It got shoved there by debt, anger, class tension, war, empire, and citizens who refused to remain quiet props in aristocratic theater. The freedom is real, and so is the hypocrisy. If we follow your life from debt bondage to the courts, Athens starts to look less like a marble birthplace and more like a city arguing with itself for 2 centuries. Solon shakes off the burdens, bans loans on the person, and opens appeal to popular justice. Later reforms weaken aristocratic bodies, expand citizen participation, and pay jurors. The poor male citizen, once threatened with seizure over debt, becomes part of the machinery that decides law. That is genuinely radical for its time. It is also limited in ways that should make the triumphal music cough. Women do not sit on juries. Enslaved people do not vote on the freedom of the citizen who owns them. Medics, the resident foreigners who help Athens function, pay taxes and serve in wars but do not get full political rights. The empire's allies help fund a democracy they do not control. Athens becomes freer by drawing a hard circle around who counts. The debt crisis reveals the core fear under Athenian democracy: dependency. To be under another man's power, to owe him your body, to have your household vulnerable to seizure, that was incompatible with citizen freedom. Solon's reforms did not end inequality, but they attacked a form of domination that made citizenship meaningless. Later, courts gave that citizen body a weapon: the vote in judgment. So, your life as a debt slave in the high courts of ancient Athens is really 2 lives stitched together. In one, you are a poor farmer staring at a mortgage stone and wondering whether your children will be taken. In the other, you are an older citizen holding a ballot, listening to elite men beg for your approval. Same city, same dusty attic sun, completely different posture. Ancient Athens never becomes the clean symbol people want. It is brilliant, hypocritical, inventive, cruel, funny, paranoid, and exhausting. It can rescue citizens from debt bondage while buying enslaved labor by the thousands. It can build courts where common men judge aristocrats, then condemn a philosopher for being annoying in public. But the next time someone says democracy was born in Athens, Remember the delivery room? It was not a shining marble hall. It was a field with a debt stone in it. A family praying the harvest would cover the loan, and a city slowly realizing that if your citizens can be repossessed, your freedom speech needs a rewrite. The stone comes down, the court fills up. The former collateral takes his seat. And somewhere, a rich creditor has the worst morning of his life. The victory still has teeth.